A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests from Roanoke County to Pearisburg in Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October and the changing of the leaves and colours were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail, or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around, and we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me, telling me, "Get your gun! Someone is outside, walking around our tent!" She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry 2 guns with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and then we sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Snap, crunch, snap. Someone or something walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had gone out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away so as to not give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, snap, crunch, crack. It sounded like it was bipedal based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like someone running away through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I am giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened and I end up sitting guard outside the tent, in the darkness, until daybreak. In the morning, I looked around a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft, moist dirt, not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the other gun, and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out to them something along the lines of, "We are armed, get the f*** out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods, in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby, and I walked to the edge, where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then, I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could, and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods, and hearing branches snap for quite a ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long way from anywhere, and quite literally on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we had been out there. I really felt we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step out onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone just messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I will never know, because I will not be returning to find out. That was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I liked to party, but holy cannoli, these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess, not being careful, not locking doors, etc. It had a very isolated and insular vibe, and anyone who was hanging around who wasn't college-aged immediately looked out of place and strange. One night, after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with 2 other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students. I was probably the least serious, actually, and when we partied it was not your typical UCSB mega rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night sleeping on our furniture or in our beds, as the case may be. That night my roommates had a few people over who I didn't know, and I saw when I returned home that one of them had opted to sleep on the couch. From the shadow that I saw there, I didn't turn the light so I wouldn't wake anyone up. But as I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom, I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy to him. He was lying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into lying as still and rigid as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me without moving his limbs, so quickly that it startled me. I could see his wide, open eyes glinting in the dark, figuring that I'd startled him or that he was drunk, or maybe on some kind of stimulant and unable to sleep. I just hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. The dude made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m. I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like somebody was drumming their fingers against the wood very quietly. I lay still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like someone scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder, until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and as hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I got my cell phone and texted my roommate because I was afraid to make a sound. "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text me back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommate to the same effect, covering all my bases. Keep in mind that the scratching has been going on at this point for a couple minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel good. He also grabbed at the knob and jiggled it super forcefully. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I know it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously terrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to terrify me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was jacked up or something, and maybe the police needed to be called, and I wanted to loop my roommates in, since it was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me, and he was scratching at my bedroom door, really damn weird." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said, "as that weird guy that was sleeping on the couch?" I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over," she said. "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while, and I had no clue where the dude had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging in the other end of the house, where my roommates, Lauren and Monica, shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the luckily locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up brawling frat bros. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me. At one point, the banging stopped, and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that this guy had slipped his fingers through the 1-inch gap between my door and the floor, and was wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which is my biggest regret about this situation, since when I look back, it would have been so awesome to just stomp the shit out of those fingers and hear the guy howl in pain. When the cops rolled up, I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing, and then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in huge holes he'd made using a pair of scissors which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realize now that he was not trying to sleep or on drugs, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there, and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. I still can't believe this really happened to me. Seems like something you hear about on the news or a movie. Okay, so for some context to this story, my friends and I were all around 14 or 15 years old during this encounter. We also lived abroad in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. We all attended an international school and we were like family. This was 5 people, mind you, a very close-knit group. Our parents generally trusted us to go off on our own in the safe parts of Prague, mainly around our school, an international school. This is relevant later on. During the summertime, we would sometimes go out to the theme park instead of our usual haunts. Of course, our parents would often come, along with siblings, so we didn't do this much. Too difficult and little alone time. But now I really understand why they always insisted on staying close and being together. On one of our visits to the theme park in late August, one of my friends, Emma, met a native guy a year older than her. Let's call him Alex. She spoke the best Czech out of all of us so they could easily communicate. They seemed to click and exchange phone numbers so they could connect with each other in the future. Immediately, I had a bad vibe coming from this guy. He certainly didn't look 16, and he had the creeper eyes running all over her body. When we eventually walked back to our parents, I tugged on her arm and suggested that she delete his phone number because of the creepy aura he seemed to have. I was the shortest of our clique, and my best friends often protected me the most if we were ever in a bad situation. I was somewhat naive at this time, which certainly didn't help my case. Emma snorted at my suggestion and told me I was just paranoid about people I didn't know. I still had the uneasy feeling, though, while Emma talked about him in line for one of the rides. Mackenzie, without a doubt the one I was closest with, noticed and asked me what was wrong while we sat together in the Czech version of A Fairyland and It's a Small World hybrid. Explaining my unease about Alex and his flimsy facade of a teenage guy, Mackenzie thankfully took my concerns seriously and helped me voice them to Emma, Chloe and Camille. Emma and Chloe thought we were being stupid, while Camille was conflicted. In hindsight, they probably thought the scary stories about girls getting sold into the sex trade were making us paranoid. We didn't get anywhere, and we eventually had to move on to the next ride. Mackenzie made Camille and I promise to help her keep an eye on Emma, but not to tell her, because she would get secretive and refuse to tell us anything. We agreed not to tell her parents unless it got out of hand, because God knows this situation was tricky enough without our parents barging in and making it worse. This was the 14-year-old mentality talking, which almost cost us. Emma and Alex talked all the time over the phone, and eventually started going on dates. She never told her parents about these, and would often cut lacrosse practice to see him. This obviously bothered us, but it was impossible to get it through that she needed to let her parents meet him, so she could stop cutting practice and hiding her relationship from them. After a while, Emma was talking about their first kiss, falling deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. Finally, around mid-October, Emma left us on one of our treks through the mall to meet Alex. Chloe was sick that day, and with no one to stop us, we decided to follow her and see where she was going to meet him. Following around 20 feet behind her, we saw her go out to the edges of the city centre, into a decrepit coffee shop. Watching from a good distance away, Alex and her sat outside and talked, occasionally stopping to sip coffee. They kissed a number of times, but Alex had an extremely eerie look, like he was driven more by lust instead of love. This brought Camille over to our side immediately, as she and Mackenzie were the only ones who had not seen Alex yet. We left then, and returned to my house to set out a game plan of trying to convince Emma that Alex was a major creeper. Before we even started, though, Emma called us to tell us about how she thought that he was the one. We quickly told her about what had been going on, and she seemed upset about it. However, we made her promise not to tell Emma that we had tattled. Instead, we proposed it could have been found out by checking her phone records. Feeling better having spilled the beans, we all returned to my house and loitered in my room until Mackenzie and Camille had to go home. The next day at school, we were confronted by a furious Emma and Chloe. They probably figured out that we had told her mum and declared that they no longer wanted to be friends with us. I was crushed, but Camille and Mackenzie assured me that they would come around to our point of view eventually. I wasn't sure our friendship would ever be the same, but I tried to convince myself that we did the right thing. A couple weeks later, while Camille was over at my house, I heard the doorbell ring. When I came to the door, it was Emma, Chloe, and Mackenzie. Their eyes looked reddish, like they had been crying, and I let them in immediately. All five of us sat at my kitchen table, and Mackenzie explained to me what had happened. After Emma's parents intervened, Emma tried to contact Alex in other ways, often leaving a note in her window with a location where they would meet. Emma and Chloe would organize it so that Emma's parents thought that she was at Chloe's house, while Emma would go out to meet Alex. This happened approximately 3 times in 3 to 4 weeks. On the second meeting, Alex convinced Emma that she should run away with him to his uncle's house in Moldova, a country to the west of Ukraine. On the third, Emma brought a bag full of clothes and such, under the pretense that she was sleeping over at Chloe's. Instead, she rode her bike to the train station and waited for Alex in a cafe near the train platforms. Apparently they talked for a while, and he gave her a muffin he had bought on the way there. Emma's father called Chloe's home minutes after she left on her bike to say that she had left her teeth covers for grinding teeth and that he was going to drop them off later on. But Chloe's mother told him that Emma wasn't coming over for a sleepover and that none had been scheduled. Remember when I said we were like sisters? Our parents were fairly close as well and trusted us enough to ask for confirmation from the friend instead of the parents at this point. Thankfully, Emma's dad knew enough to take the car off to the train station to look for her. He apparently saw her bike in the racks outside of the train station and dashed through the station looking for her. Before he even had to go into the station itself, however, he saw Alex, along with two other older men, walking to a large grey van carrying Emma. He ran at them, yelling and causing a huge scene. They dropped her, ran to the grey van and drove off. When Emma's dad checked on Emma, it looked like she was knocked out with sleeping medication, Rohypnol or something similar. She was taken to the doctor's office to make sure she was all right. The police were called, and the whole thing was investigated. They never managed to track down Alex, but the police officers informed Emma's parents about young teenage girls being groomed to be kidnapped and taken to other countries like Serbia or Russia and sold into the sex trade. I listened to all of this with Camille, horrified looks on our faces, and when Mackenzie finished, Emma started crying, while she and Chloe apologized for not listening to us. We hugged it out and stayed at my house for several hours to reconnect. Since then, our friendship has been stronger, and a strong unspoken policy has been enacted in our school to let the family meet the other half of the relationship. I don't think this experience will ever leave me, even if it didn't happen to me. As it's been established by this subreddit, if you get weird feelings about someone, don't hesitate to follow your gut instinct. I just learned of this story over the weekend when my Uncle Si was in town. He has always been a jokester, and growing up, he'd always be pulling pranks and laughing. I don't think I'd ever seen him serious before this moment. He is a huge car fan, and asked to see my new Infiniti G37 sedan, so I took him out in my grandpa's driveway to show him the car with my dad. We did the usual pop the hood and rev the engine type stuff, and we all pretended that we knew what we were looking at as we stared into the hood of the car, when my uncle said he wanted to tell us about something that happened to him in college that he felt would serve as a good lesson to me. This is honestly the first time I'd ever heard him talk very seriously, with a tone of fear in his voice. He trembled as he first started telling the story and said that he hadn't ever told anyone about this before, but seeing me with my new car and the fact that I'm a young guy made him want to bestow some knowledge upon me. My uncle went to a rural college. The campus was in the middle of a town of about 10,000 people. Most were college students or worked at the college, but there were some locals. He moved off campus his junior year and lived about 3 miles outside town and the bar districts. After having quite a few beers with his friends, he decided he better walk home since he had an exam that morning. As he was walking down the country road with cornfields on both sides of the road, a man in a truck pulled up who appeared to be a friendly farmer. He offered to give my uncle a lift to save him the walk. My uncle, being drunk and not thinking straight, took him up on his offer. He got in the front seat and they took off. He gave the man directions to the house he lived in with his college buddies, and then, about 5 minutes into the drive, noticed that the man had gone past the turn he needed to take. He informed the man that his house was behind them and he needed to turn around. But the older farmer said that he'd lived in this town for 50 years and knew a shortcut he would teach him. That's when my uncle began to get suspicious. He started asking questions and surveying his situation. The farmer obviously had a final destination as he continued down the road, then eventually pulled into an old driveway with a very old barn that was falling apart. My uncle said the roof was halfway caved in. My uncle's plan was to bolt the second the man slowed down, so when the farmer slowed down and parked, my uncle pushed the unlock latch and gave the door a shove. The lock had been sawed off and only part of it popped up. At this point, he knew he was in for it. The driveway was made of gravel, and there was a very old playground set in the front yard that was completely rusted and falling apart. There was also a shed in the back of the property, behind the barn, that he said had lights on, but the rest of the property was dark and only illuminated by the headlights of the truck and the moon. My uncle ended the story very abruptly with, "Then I fought him off and sprinted home," and then casually said, "Let's go back inside." My dad stared at him the rest of the night, and he kept to himself. I don't think he wanted to admit it, but something obviously happened at that farm. Never accept rides from anyone. A while ago, I was staying at an upscale hotel in the safe area of a large Midwestern city. I'm a 16-year-old female, and I was in a room all by myself with my parents a few doors down. In theory, this isn't unsafe by any means, but I had bad luck on this particular trip. Our first night there passed without incident, me in my room, my parents in theirs. I watched a pay-per-view movie and ate way too much from the snack bar. I didn't have any reason to feel unsafe. The next morning we did the usual tourist stuff that one does when visiting a new city. As we ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, I noticed a man who looked to be in his 60s staring at me for an abnormally long amount of time. I won't lie, as a young, decently attractive female, I'm used to getting the occasional inappropriate look from a guy, so I ignored it, and chalked it up to him either being a perv, or thinking I looked like his granddaughter or something. The next night, my parents allowed me to meet up with a friend for dinner who lived in the area. He met me in the hotel lobby, and we had a nice dinner, and then went back to the hotel for drinks. Yes, I am underage. I had a drink. Shoot me now. Coincidentally, the same man who had been eyeing me earlier was at the bar. This time I knew I didn't remind him of his granddaughter. Even with my buff guy friend next to me, his eyes traced every curve of my body. I felt unsettled and mentioned it to my friend Ethan, who glanced over and also seemed really weirded out by how obvious this guy was leering. We left the bar quickly, and by now it was around 12:30 a.m. Ethan walked me to the elevators of the hotel, and once I pushed the button, he left. I wish I would have asked him to stay, because no sooner had he walked away that my creeper came rounding the corner and stood there waiting with me for the elevator. I felt so uncomfortable knowing that he would be seeing what floor I was going to, but it hadn't occurred to me to get off on a different floor at the time. But even if it did, he planned on following me, so it would have been just as bad a move. When we were in the elevator together, I tried to keep my eyes averted from his, but they literally bore into my body. He kept trying to step closer, and I kept backing up, too scared to even speak. What freaked me out even more was that he hadn't pressed a separate elevator button, so he planned on getting off when I did. When I got to my floor, I almost ran to my room, and the guy just stood at the end of the hallway waiting to see where I was going. I stayed in my room for 15 minutes until I was sure he was gone before I told my parents what had happened. They freaked out and told the hotel staff, but there was no sign of the guy and it was really late, so I just locked my door and tried to get to sleep. I had almost drifted off when I heard a knock at my door. Now, I'm not an idiot. I've creeped this subreddit and nosleep for a long time, so I didn't just go and open the door at nearly 2 a.m. Instead, I turned on a light and froze. At this point, my intuition had kicked in, and I knew it was the guy. I was near tears, but the knocking kept continuing, harder and harder, so I finally shouted and asked who it was. The voice that replied to me was the most chilling thing I have ever heard. High-pitched, but growly, almost giggly, and so disturbing I can barely describe it. "It's hotel staff, please let me in." I was terrified. A look through the peephole confirmed that it was the same creepy old guy. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my dad's phone. He has a habit of always keeping his ringer on, so he answered me almost immediately, and I tried to tell him what was wrong through my tears. "The guy from before," I managed, "is at my door." And what happened next gives me nightmares. My dad naturally went into superhero mode and opened his door to find the old man in just a robe, masturbating. It's pretty obvious to piece together what he was planning, and I still dream about it and have severe PTSD from it. My dad slugged the dude in the face and made sure he didn't move an inch, while my mum called hotel security. We pressed charges and the guy is in prison now on what I think are assault with intent to commit rape charges, but I could be wrong. It was a terrifying ordeal, and I hope none of you ever have to go through something like that. To clear up a few things, I'm sorry if the word ladies in the title offends anybody. I don't mean to insinuate that only women should be aware of their surroundings, because anybody can be a target for any kind of crime. But generally, statistically speaking, women are usually more targeted for this kind of thing than men are. If that's offensive to anybody, I'm sorry. But look up the facts. Women get creeped on in a sexual way a hell of a lot more. Sad but true. Next, when dealing with the hotel management, concierge and police that night, we discovered that this man had been trying to get a key to my room even before the elevator incident, where he watched me run to my room. He hadn't used my name or anything, he just said, "Can I please get the key to room such and such," with no other explanation. What I think is that he knew where I was staying before the elevator incident, but wanted to make it known to me that he knew. Otherwise, I'm not sure how he knew which room I was staying in. It unnerves me to this day, thinking that he'd probably see me go in and out without me noticing. And to all who were wondering, I was able to be served at a bar as a 16-year-old thanks to a fake ID. I'm a bartender. I meet all sorts of people, lots of creepy people, but every once in a while I meet a gem. The bar I worked at the time was directly across the street from a major full-service hotel, think Hyatt. So I'm at work and this decent-looking guy comes in and sits down at my bar, orders a beer, asks for a menu. He's by himself and starts chatting me up. Nothing out of the ordinary, no big deal. He's talking to me about the show True Blood, which at the time I think had just finished its first season. Telling me about the theme song, if I remember correctly, which makes sense since I worked in a kind of rockabilly bar. It was a day shift for me, so after the dinner rush, I cleared my tab with him, good tipper, and agreed to sit and have a drink with him when he offered. Once again, all very common and normal. I've finished my drink, and I'm thinking about heading down the street to my favourite pub to meet a couple of friends. I asked him if he would like to join me. He tells me he would like to, but asks if I mind if he swings by his hotel room first to grab a sweater. I didn't even think. I said yes. So up we go to his fancy room. He offers me something from the minibar. I accept. We aren't meeting my friends for another half an hour or so, and this guy seems totally normal. He pulls out his laptop and plays the theme song he was telling me about. Nothing unusual. I have to use the bathroom, so I excuse myself. My drink is done and we're getting ready to leave. When I emerge, he asks me if I noticed the second toothbrush. I don't understand. He points out that there are 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom, but he's travelling alone. I tell him I assume he got a 2-pack or something. Why would I notice that? He tells me that he had been to the bar yesterday for lunch and sat at a table. He noticed how friendly I was with my regular customers, you know, my job, and that I seemed easy to talk to. It's in the job description, and that he hoped he wasn't being too forward. He was. But he wondered if maybe I would spend the night with him, and if I agreed, he wanted to make sure I didn't feel uncomfortable or anything. What, the French toast? I basically just told him we will see at the end of the night because my friends were waiting for us and I didn't want to ditch them. I figured it was best to play along at least a little bit so I could safely get out of there. And I scolded myself for being such an idiot. Who the hell goes to a complete stranger's hotel room? Jesus, give your head a shake. The elevator ride is excruciating. He keeps brushing his knuckles on my hand and caressing my shoulder and whatnot. We get outside finally, and I text my friends, telling them about this giant fucking weirdo I've managed to get myself all wrapped up with. At this point, I'm creeped out and kind of scared to tell him I'm not interested. I mean, what he did wasn't really that bad, but I'm getting some major bad vibes from him. We go to a pub, but not the one I'm meeting friends at. We walk in, find a table, order a drink each. I tell him my friends are meeting us there. He makes some small talk, asks me what my favourite foods are, and if I've ever seen this HBO show called Rome. I tell him no, I haven't, I'll have to look for it. He tells me he will lend me his box set of DVDs. You know, the guy travelling from out of town. Great. So I finish about half of my drink and tell him I need to pee. Here's where my genius plan emerges. The washrooms are situated at the back of the pub, right beside a door marked employees only, a loading hall to the beer cooler. At the end, the rear exit. I know everyone who works at the pub. I think just about everyone in the industry within a certain 5-block radius in my city knows each other. So I boot out the door, which faces the back alley and rear patio entrance of the bar I work at. I go inside my bar, hide in the office, and tell my friends to come pick me up. Less than 5 minutes later, we were happily on our way to another part of town. Here's where it gets really messed up. I woke up the next day to someone ringing my doorbell. It's a taxi driver. I go to tell him that I didn't order a taxi. He tells me he has a delivery for me. Some guy paid him to drop a box off. Okay. It's a box set of Rome on DVD, and tub of Ben & Jerry's Chunky Monkey, and a long, pretty much love letter telling me how much he enjoyed the brief time we spent together. He would love to see me again and hopes he's not being too forward. He really wants to show me what it feels like to be treated like a goddess, etc. What the actual hell? I didn't give him my address. I didn't even give him my phone number. And no one from work would just give out that kind of information. I had been working there for years. I trusted all of my co-workers, not to mention it's illegal. I still to this day have no idea how he found out where I live. I didn't eat the ice cream. This happened August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces Airman, military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of colour that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be at the very least a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing, full of dread. I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go, let's get the hell out of here." Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was lying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone, though he could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I've not returned to the area and don't intend to. I wish I had more closure on the case, but I do not. I am a 22-year-old male. I live in a pretty weird part of Sydney. Not overly dangerous, but a lot of druggies and weirdos who can really creep you out late at night. Which is when this took place, of course. I just got off the train and started my 10-minute walk home. It was cold and it was late, almost midnight, so I was moving quickly to get home. I was catching up to this guy who was dressed in a big bomber jacket and was singing to himself. I just figured he was another local oddball and kept walking along next to him, wishing I'd remembered my headphones because his singing was rubbish. Him and I walked along about a metre or two apart, and at some point a woman about my age came out of a side street carrying a bunch of books. We were all walking together in a nice awkward sort of situation as this guy sang, when suddenly he piped up and said to the girl in a creepy raspy voice, "Excuse me, but why are you carrying a book about Bikram yoga?" The girl responded politely that she was studying to be a yoga instructor. The guy stated he was in fact a yoga instructor, and they struck up a slow and slightly uncomfortable conversation. Initially, I was just relieved he wasn't talking to me. I am not a tough guy at all, and confrontations freak me out, so I was glad I didn't have to speak to him. I kept walking just ahead of them though, and in listening to their conversation, I did begin to notice that the guy seemed to know very little about yoga. And as they continued to talk, his questions got stranger, asking what she was up to, if she lived with friends or alone. I decided to walk a bit slower, so I stayed close to them in case anything went wrong or the guy tried anything. I had no idea what I'd do if push came to shove. I just felt it was the right thing to do. So this all went on for another 5 minutes or so, and I was getting close to my street. The girl was obviously uncomfortable and just wanted the conversation to end. I was almost at my corner, and feeling my job as a gentleman was done, I decided to just take one look over my shoulder before I left them. I looked over my shoulder and stopped mid-stride. The guy was walking with the girl on his right, and in his left hand, obscured from her view, he was holding a knife. I stopped and stood there like an idiot. There was no one else around, just us three now standing still, and the guy looked at me and shook his head, giving me a "just walk away buddy" kind of look with anger in his eyes. Then I almost jumped when I heard a car horn, and I looked across the street to see a parked dark blue car with a man in the driver's seat. He too was shaking his head at me with that sort of look that said, "Get out of here before something bad happens." This was a joint effort, and thinking back I can remember car headlights following us for most of this. I just hadn't taken any note of it. It seems this was a joint effort by the two creepers. My heart was racing, and there I was standing in between this completely screwed up situation. It seemed like I was the only thing preventing this rape, kidnapping or whatever from going down, and I with nothing resembling a weapon, I felt very, very useless indeed. Not a word had been said so far, and in my terror my mind flashed to something I once read about what you should do if you're attacked by a bear. I guess it was flight or fight, and I picked fight. I raised my arms up to try to look bigger and started screaming like an animal. I must have seemed completely deranged, but I got right up in the guy's face, and I still don't know how this worked, but it must have been so shocking that he just bolted, ran to the car and got in, sped away, all of it happening in the space of 10 seconds or so. After that we called the police. The girl thanked me profusely, but after all of this I couldn't even remember what the guy looked like, nor the number plate of the car. I just couldn't believe how fortunate it all was. I'd forgotten my headphones, so I could hear the exchange, the fact I'd turned around for one last look, and that the whole screaming and waving my arms around actually worked. I shudder to think what could have happened to the young yoga student if everything didn't work out. This happened to me a few years ago, and I don't often talk about it, since it's weird and gory, and not the kind of story you whip out at cocktail parties. But here goes. A couple years ago, I was stressed out from college and big city life, and decided to spend a long weekend in the woods, doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy, and us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods free camping, in the winter, alone. While this sounds like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you are an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warrior princess my dad always hoped I'd be. I always hated the feeling of claustrophobia that came with being female in the city, avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone out in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom. Or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the roads, the surroundings getting wilder and wilder as I drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch, and with a compass and a map, hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in a clearing with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a couple of beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds and the very distant rumblings of the half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I came out at the exact place I had intended to. I punched a hole in the thin crust of ice and set to getting my fishing on. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fishes will be hungry. I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to just clean the fish here and now and take it straight back to camp to cook. Yummy. I quickly realized my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral senses was irritating me, but I was very set in my task, focusing on the motions in the slippery mess. The thing in the periphery was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I carved and hacked and sliced my hand open freshly as the fish slipped out of my hands and into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "F off with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed, and then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise that I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence weighed down on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt, and no hunter would give himself away like that, and if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst? Yelled something vulgar back? Apologized? No, nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods. Silence as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twitterings of a bird or something, I just decided the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder, and headed for camp. I trudged off in the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow, apprehensive but drawn, like a moth to the flame. I trudged up to what materialized in the closing distance as a moose kill. A really, really good moose kill. A clean shot through the upturned eye, staring at me and saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread I couldn't translate. I ran hard and I ran fast. In the snow and the woods, everything looked the same. I knew I was moving south, and I knew I'd past camp on the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a weary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of the woods clearing ahead, to make way for the country roadway. I looked to my left and saw my car 50 yards or so down, jogged to it and drove the lonely 15 miles to the first motel I saw signs for. I had none of my belongings and no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. It was only as I was sitting up watching infomercials that night that it started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they allowed hunting? The moose defied everything of my rudimentary understanding of hunting. Even with the snow to cool it, decomp starts quickly on an animal that size. You'd have time for a few quick pictures, but you'd want to have it dressed quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How could you ever drag it back to the road? In the morning, in a sleep-deprived and paranoid state, I described everything I'd seen and thought I heard to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more vexed about illegal hunting than any of my crazy city girl ramblings. He said he wanted to come pick me up and have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I said I was only going if he brought a gun. He sighed with exasperation and told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back, as if on the back of the world's awkwardest motorcycle. We got to a large impression in the snow where the moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail in the snow, as if the carcass were on a tarp. The ranger said he should take me back now. He asked where my camp was. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. It looked like he was finally sharing in my unease. Back at the hotel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He said darkly, "You don't want them back? They're covered in moose mess." "So, what happens now?" "Well, miss, we're just going to keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard of or seen anything like this ever before. I'm really sorry this happened." And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried every different application of reason. A hunter who needed help but knew I was already gone. A deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill? One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep woods Sweeney Todd. He dubbed him Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear the gunshot. The whistling seems so vivid in my memory. But was it even real? One question has been definitely answered. I'll never go into the woods alone again. This happened to me 4 years ago. It's by far the most extreme and life-threatening situation I've been in. The eyewitness account you are about to read is 100% true and is mine. For some understanding, this happened in the United States. It was the summer of 2012. My longtime boyfriend and I had recently gotten married. Even though we were dirt-poor college students and lived in a dinky apartment, we were having a blast. That particular summer, we gathered with our friends at the local movie theatre almost every weekend. There was one just down the street from our apartment that had really cheap movie tickets. A night out that was under $10 was certainly within our budget. Anyway, one Thursday night I received a call from this group of friends inviting us to watch the midnight premiere of the newest Batman movie. I had just finished working a 12-hour shift and was pretty tired. I almost refused the invitation and thought of crashing in my apartment instead. However, I didn't want to miss out on the fun, and it was a movie I'd wanted to see for a while anyway. Certainly it wouldn't do any harm to stay up later than usual and miss a few hours of sleep, right? At 10:30 p.m, we met at the theatre. We passed large cardboard cutouts of Catwoman and Batman as we walked inside, greeted by the smell of buttery popcorn and the chatter of excited moviegoers. The ticket booth was to the right of the entrance, and just above that was an electronic list of movies being played. The 12 a.m. showing of The Dark Knight Rises was displayed up there in bright red letters. Being paranoid that the tickets would sell out quickly, one of my friends swung by earlier that day and purchased tickets for all of us. We bypassed the ticket line and went straight to the ticket taker. She smiled at us and kindly directed us to Theatre 9, which was on the right side of the lobby. If only I had known what I do now, that among the crowds a killer was lurking, that as I walked across that tacky red and purple carpet towards Theatre 9, I could have been walking to my death. I think about it often now, what I would have done had I known. Pulled the fire alarm, called the police, screamed for people to run away. But of course I had no way of knowing what was about to happen. Oblivious to the peril I was putting myself in, I pushed open the doors for Theatre 9 without giving it a second thought. The hallway in this theatre was shaped like a U, and you could go either right or left. Theatre 9 was the largest screening room in the building, perfect for accommodating the crowds that midnight premieres brought in. The screen was motionless and grey. Not even the previews had started yet, because there was still a good hour and a half to go until the movie actually started. We entered on the right side, so all of the seats were to our left. I remember being surprised at just how packed the theatre already was. Just about every seat was filled, much to our dismay. At first it seemed like we wouldn't find a spot to sit together. Now, the way this theatre was set up, there was a section of seats right in front of the screen. This area was flat, and there were about 5 rows of seating in this section. A lot of seats in that section were empty, but sitting right in front of the movie screen sucks, and none of us wanted to sit there. One of my friends then spotted a row with 5 empty seats all next to each other, perfect for the amount of people we had. These seats were about 3 to 4 rows up from where the seating rows start to elevate. We ran up the stairs before someone could take the seats and filed in. My husband Brock sat in the 5th seat. I sat next to him, and my friend Samantha sat next to me on my right side. Her boyfriend Tommy sat next to her, and another friend named Leo sat in the aisle seat. We spent the next several minutes casually chatting, joking around and laughing. After a while my 3 friends went to the lobby to buy drinks and that addicting movie theatre popcorn. While they were gone, Brock and I passed the time by people watching. The theatre was bright since the lights weren't dimmed yet, and I could see everyone clearly. There were a lot of people dressed in Batman t-shirts and hoodies. One person even had a mask, and one of those shirts with an attached cape. There were a lot of kids in attendance as well, which wasn't surprising because, even though it was a Thursday night, it was summer vacation, so that meant no school the next day. Of all the people I saw, the person I will never forget was the little girl sitting in our same row a few chairs away. She was really cute, blonde with blue eyes, and passed us several times on her way to the lobby, each time coming back with various snacks and popcorn. Overall, people seemed very excited to see the movie, and the room was filled with energy and laughter. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the lights started to dim and the previews began. Just like every movie I've seen before, a quick animation flashed across the screen, reminding us to get refreshments from the lobby. We were already devouring that popcorn like ravenous animals. There were reminders to silence our cell phones and to make sure we know where the emergency exits are. The animation had this ugly CGI cat in a tuxedo that was sitting in a movie theatre. I casually glanced at the bright green emergency exit signs that were on the left and right sides of the movie screen. I didn't think much of the reminder, like usual. After that, I only remember one preview for The Man of Steel. The others, I'm not sure what they were about. When the movie started, the theatre erupted into cheering and clapping. The title of the movie, The Dark Knight Rises, exploded onto the screen. This was followed by the scene where Bane is hijacking a plane. I thought this scene was pretty cool, and it caught my interest right away. Only when the movie started to get a little less interesting did I remember just how tired I was. I decided I would close my eyes at the more boring parts to get a little bit of rest. I had been awake for 20 hours at that point, so I was rightfully sleepy. My eyes were closed for most of the duration of Batman and Catwoman's encounter. I don't really remember what was going on in that part of the movie. Perhaps some of you have seen it and know what I'm talking about. Anyway, when I opened my eyes again, Bruce Wayne was on his computer digging up information on Catwoman. This is the last scene I saw. I never got to watch the rest of the movie. All of a sudden, a loud bang erupted from the left side of the theatre. I sort of screamed a little because it startled me. A strange smell started to fill the auditorium. It was like the smell of a firework, so I thought it was a cherry bomb or something similar. Has someone thrown fireworks into the crowd as a prank? Then, down near the right side of the movie screen, the dark silhouette of a person caught my attention. They were just a black frame against the bright movie screen. A series of flashing lights was coming from this person. It was a weird moment where time literally slowed down and everything went strangely quiet. I was completely frozen, unable to move and really unable to think at all. It was like my brain had stopped working entirely. Brock caught on immediately to what was happening, and he grabbed me. He pulled me to the ground and lay on top of me, shielding me with his own body. At this point, time and sound returned to me. I could hear the gunshots ringing out across the theatre. People were screaming. The movie was still playing on top of it all, creating a chaotic explosion of sound. I realized the flashing lights I had seen were bullets flying out of a gun barrel. An instant sensation of adrenaline flooded my body. There was absolutely nothing I could do except lay there and hope to God that the bullets I heard ripping through seats and walls wouldn't go through me too. At one point, shrapnel hit my head, cutting off a good chunk of my hair, and as I reached for the spot to make sure it wasn't bleeding, hot pieces of metal fell into my hand. I was lying face up, so I could see everything that was happening. The lights from a still-playing movie danced across the ceiling and walls. My friends were on the floor with me. Our unfinished bucket of popcorn was spilled all across the floor. Leo had his legs sticking out into the aisle, because there wasn't enough room for him to hide completely behind the seats. At some point, Samantha's water bottle, which had been in the cup holder between our seats, exploded. Water splashed all over my face. The smell of gun smoke was overwhelming. Riot-grade tear gas made me cry and caused me to cough uncontrollably. There was another smell too, the horrible metallic smell of blood that I'll never forget. I remember my lower body feeling wet all of a sudden. For some reason I thought this came from the leaking water bottle, but I soon realized this wasn't the case. All of a sudden things went strangely quiet. The bullets had stopped for some reason. Tommy shouted, "Let's get out of here!" We took advantage of the opportunity and made a run for it. We ran down the stairs, across the front of the screen towards a bright green exit sign. We crammed into a small closet-like space where the door was. It was so dark we had a hard time finding it. We were screaming and slamming on the walls to find the door, blinded by the tear gas and dumbfounded by shock. Then, finally, my hands felt the metal door handle, and I pushed against it with all my strength. The door flew open, and the light of a nearby streetlight flooded our eyes. We pushed against the door so hard that we all fell over onto the concrete. Samantha lost her pink flip-flops just outside this doorway. As I scrambled to my feet and literally ran for my life, I realized my legs were red, absolutely soaked with blood. It was like I dipped my legs into a bathtub full of it. I checked my body all over and realized I wasn't injured at all. Where did this blood come from? I looked behind me and realized that the blood was my husband's. He had been shot in the leg. A massive gaping hole had ripped through the lower half of Brock's right leg. His foot was barely hanging on and dangled lifelessly. Leo and a young man I didn't recognize were carrying Brock because, after falling outside the door, he lost all his strength and he couldn't walk. I was completely shocked. I had no idea he had been injured, especially since he was right behind me the whole time and managed to escape the theatre all by himself. How he did it on one foot, I'll never know. At this point I screamed. My scream was so loud that it alerted nearby construction workers. At the back of the theatre there was a narrow parking lot, followed by a grassy lawn and then the street beyond that. The construction workers were doing road repair on this street, but as soon as they heard my scream and saw us running, they stopped working and watched what was going on. I'm not sure why this is such a vivid part of my memory. Anyway, they carried Brock along the back sidewalk all the way to the end, where the corner of the building is. This was quite a distance, several dozen feet. My husband then collapsed from exhaustion and pain, saying he couldn't move anymore. He lay down, and a puddle of blood started to form beneath him. I looked back and realized we had left a trail of blood leading from the door all the way to our current position. I was trembling. I knelt beside Brock and glanced around to see who else was injured. Tommy had been shot in the knee and the hip, and was further away in the parking lot. The teenager who helped my husband was also injured. His dad and mum were with him. His mum was sitting against the wall and looked like she was going to pass out. She was bleeding from several places. That family escaped at the same time we did. I guess they heard the bullets stop and decided to make a run for it too. We were all lucky because the shooting was still going on inside. I had to take off my shirt and use it to stop the bleeding. I'll never forget how lifeless and limp his leg felt, and I imagined that's what a dead body must feel like. I got blood all over my hands and arms. The police showed up really fast. I'd say we were only outside for a minute or two before the red and blue sirens filled the night and rushed to our location. We were literally a block away from the police station. A female officer stood by us the whole time until paramedics arrived, which took a very long time. Brock was one of the last to be taken to a hospital. He was bleeding out for almost 20 minutes before an ambulance pulled up on the same street with the roadwork. At this point he had become almost unresponsive and was on the verge of unconsciousness. Several massive guys rushed across the grass with a stretcher, loaded him onto it, and then ran with him back to the waiting ambulance. I wasn't able to go with him because there was another injured person in the ambulance, and it was too crowded. I wandered around to the front of the theatre alone, unsure of where my friends had gone. My blood-stained shirt and a pool of blood were left behind on the corner of that sidewalk. Walking through the crowds felt like a dream. I couldn't believe what just happened. People were in hysterics and crying. A lot of people such as me were covered in blood. And, like me, I'm pretty sure the blood staining their skin and clothes wasn't their own. A lot of people seemed to notice how lonely and dazed I looked, so they kept me company and even offered me a ride to different hospitals to find Brock, because I hadn't been told what hospital he was taken to. I hung around these people for a while as police swarmed the area and asked us what we saw inside the theatre. The whole parking lot was on lockdown, and we weren't going to be allowed to leave any time soon. It was around 2 a.m, so it was still very dark outside, and I was pretty cold, wearing only an undershirt and shorts. The flashing red and blue lights of what seemed like 100 police cars were blinding. I remember seeing a big police vehicle pull up that said something like Crime Scene Investigation Unit on it. I think that's when it really sank in and hit me. I started to get sick to my stomach and wanted to vomit, but somehow I was able to hold it back. Eventually, police started letting people leave. I jumped into my truck and booked it out of there. I was in such a panic that I didn't even think to go back to my apartment, grab my cell phone, which I had forgotten, and call my parents or someone else to help me. I was angry, upset, scared, and most of all still in a state of shock. Was I really going to lose Brock only a month shy of our first wedding anniversary because of some psychopath with a gun? Thankfully, by the time dawn rolled around, I found the hospital he was treated in. This was in the next city over, maybe 45 minutes from the theatre if you're going the speed limit. I was so happy to be there, and the hospital staff were all so welcoming and understanding. After making sure I wasn't injured as well, they let me wait in the ICU room that Brock would be placed in when he was done recovering from surgery. I was so glad he was alive. Brock and Tommy both had survived, though many others weren't so lucky. I found out the following day, after some much-needed sleep on a hospital couch, that 12 people were killed in this shooting and over 70 were injured. I remember they first thought 15 people were killed, but the real number was 12. The little blonde girl sitting in my row did not survive. She died in the theatre no more than a few feet from us. She had been shot multiple times. A heartbroken police officer who cried during his court testimony tried unsuccessfully to save her by carrying her out of the theatre and having her sent to a hospital. Tommy was rushed to a different hospital in the back of a police car. He underwent surgery and made a full recovery. The bullet missed his hip bone and narrowly missed his urinary tract and bladder. According to the surgeons, my husband lost almost half his blood. Brock made it to the hospital just in time. Any later and he would have died. He underwent several blood transfusions and was in the hospital for 21 days. The wound to his leg was severe enough that they had to amputate it after trying unsuccessfully to save it. It's been so long since the shooting happened that my husband, friends and I have been able to recover from it somewhat. The event was pretty horrifying and has left us scarred for sure. I wouldn't consider that part of the story to be creepy though. No, the creepy part is the shooter himself. I later learned much about him from the murder trial that would follow in the coming years. Though my encounter with this man was very brief, he has affected my life greatly. Just to know that people like this exist is disturbing. He is certainly one twisted individual that I never want to see again. I learned everything from watching the televised trial that took place in early 2015. This guy was going to school for neuroscience or something in California. I guess he was a pretty smart guy. However, for some reason, he had an obsession with killing people and had a stalker mentality. After dropping out of his university, he moved to my state and chose my local theatre to commit a mass shooting. Before that, he was planning on hiding along remote hiking trails up in the mountains, jumping people, pulling them into the woods and killing them there, though he never went through with that idea. He stalked my theatre for months and had this shooting all planned out for the night of July 20th. Though I never saw him before, it's unnerving to think this guy could have been watching us every time we went to the theatre, and we would have never known it. We were completely unaware of what he had planned against us. This completely ruined my sense of security, because who knows what the stranger next to you is planning on doing to you. I came very close to the shooter, but I never actually saw his face in person until I was forced to testify in court. Of course I saw his mugshots on television, but while in the theatre, I only saw him as a dark silhouette in the shadows, like a demonic figure rendered from the darkest and most sinister nightmare. He was even in the hallway that we passed upon running for the emergency exit. The only thing stopping him from killing us there and then was his jammed assault rifle. To commit this crime, he ordered a few thousand rounds of ammo, riot gear and armor, tear gas, an assault rifle and a shotgun. He took pictures of himself, which were shown in court, wearing all of this gear like some sick trophy and holding up these weapons with a menacing smile. He dyed his hair orange and put in these creepy black contacts while making devilish faces into his camera, something that made me sick just looking at it. Before driving to the theatre with all of this gear in his car, he booby-trapped his entire apartment and set it to explode if anyone opened the door. Then, once at the theatre, he posed as a moviegoer and even bought a ticket for the movie. I think his ticket had Theatre 8 on it, which was next door, but Theatre 9 had more people in it, so he went into number 9 instead. He was in the few front rows. I must have passed him several times in the lobby while he was there. Maybe he had seen me too. At some point during the movie, he got up and went through the side exit, which didn't have an alarm for some reason, kept it propped open with something, then went to his car to put on all his armor and grabbed his weapons. Then he came back inside and started shooting. When we escaped the theatre, we ran past his white car, which was parked right at the exit. We didn't even notice it. At some point he came outside, and he would have seen us there on the concrete. I don't know what stopped him from shooting people that were outside too, but he could have easily ended us there and then, if he wanted to. I think the hardest part for me was facing this twisted individual in court. I'll never forget rising as they called my name, walking down the centre row past my family, other survivors, and crowds of news-hungry media personnel. I sat right across from him, maybe only 10 feet away. While his orange hair was gone and he wasn't wearing black contacts, being so close to him was a creepy and uncomfortable experience. My encounters with this man are certainly ones I will never forget. I can now say that I've come face to face with a true deranged psychopath. He just had this blank stare in his eyes the whole time. If eyes truly are the windows to the soul, then his soul was filled with nothing but a cold indifference for those he had murdered and harmed. He wouldn't even look at me. Sitting across from him in court was the second time I had knowingly been in the same room with this man. A man who had tried to take my life but thankfully failed. A man who would end up spending forever behind bars when, at the end of it all, he was sentenced to 3,318 years in prison for his crimes. Also, my friends Leo, Samantha and I escaped without injury. A lot of people will probably ask, so I thought I'd mention that. No, I will not be giving any more information about my identity for obvious reasons. I do have photos of my husband's injury, though I will not likely post them here for his privacy and for the graphic nature of the photo. This is to the man who tried to kill me, the man who has caused countless nightmares and fueled the fires of my paranoia, the man who hurt my friends and family, causing years of untold grief for my husband, because he will never walk the same again, the man who stole the innocence and joy from a 6-year-old child who went into that theatre alive and came out dead, to the man who carried out the worst mass shooting in Colorado history. Let's not meet again, ever. I hope you rot in prison. I had mostly forgotten about this story until someone linked me to this subreddit. After thoroughly creeping myself out for a few days, I decided to contribute as well. For many years, I spent my summers working in a major southern US city with a moderately high crime rate and some serious racial conflict. Now, I grew up in New York City and live there to this day, and I'm not overly afraid of walking around in some of my city's more infamous areas at night. But I think it's important to respect the city you're in, and I knew that this southern city was quite a bit more dangerous for me to walk around alone in, especially as a young petite woman. I am 5 feet tall, 105 pounds. I'm pretty strong, a lot stronger than people think by looking at me, but I know better than to think I would do too well in a one-on-one fight. To be honest, in my summer city, I wouldn't usually even walk home alone after work, since I worked until 10 p.m. or later, even though it was only a 10-minute walk. It seemed silly to ask someone for a ride when it was a lovely and short walk through a gorgeous city, but I also just knew that I didn't feel safe. It wasn't even the caution I have sometimes felt in a crummy neighborhood back home, but just a totally different feeling, a complete inability to be confidently safe. I loved my summers there, but I avoided being alone after dark at all costs. But as often happens, we make little compromises. It was midnight, and the only other person in the office was staying for another couple hours, while one of the events we were managing wound down. He asked if I wanted him to drive me home, but I knew that this would mean locking the entire building up, driving like 2 minutes, then 2 minutes back, and then disarming the security system again, etc. And I just felt silly, like a scared little girl. So I said, "Nah, I'll be okay, I only live a few blocks away," and I went on my merry way. I walked with my head up, my strides sure, my ears open, just like I do back home. I travelled 1 block and then another. It was a gorgeous night, and I let myself enjoy it and relax a little bit, as I hoped in vain for a gentle breeze to cool me off a little, and enjoyed the symphony of the various insects that came out at night. It was ungodly humid, and I didn't see a single other person, definitely a different type of city than NYC, but I could hear the gentle hum of nightlife from the main drag 1 avenue over. I reached a 3rd block, and then I saw another person, a man. Of course, I thought to myself as my anxiety ratcheted up, and I instantly admonished myself for my bias. I was out walking alone at night after all. Why didn't a man have the same right? But, and this has never happened to me before or since, something about the sight of that man, that specific man, terrified me. I couldn't tell you why. He was in his mid-20s and had long shaggy hair. As the moonlight reflected off of him, I could see it was blonde. Everything about him struck me as just sort of an anomaly. I don't mean to make such judgments, but at that time of night, most of the white people in the area are in bed, or in groups heading to or from the bar together. Of course, then again, I'm white too, so... He looked like a surfer, not a stalker. He actually looked pretty cute, and yet I could hardly bear to look at him, because looking at him filled me with fear and apprehension. I know that you can never tell, but it really just struck me how much this guy did not look like the sort of guy who would terrify me, and yet how absolutely terrified he made me feel, for reasons I couldn't articulate. There was nothing objectively scary about him, and yet I just felt this sickening dread as we slowly approached each other. It wasn't just that I was alone at night. I didn't know what it was, but I knew he scared me. His vibe was just off, and I was picking up on it heavily. He was walking towards me, and I had to walk towards him to get home. We got closer. He got bigger and bigger as he approached, and I felt smaller and smaller as I approached him. Maybe a minute passed. Soon we were on the same block. I willed myself to just get past him and get it over with, and yet when I was about 20 away from him I stopped. I don't know why, I just really didn't want to walk past him. It almost felt like I couldn't make myself go any closer. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself, and I even began to blush in the dark summer night, embarrassed by my behaviour. But, just to ease my mind, I crossed the street, feeling foolish, and then he crossed the street. "Don't come any closer to me," I said loudly, without even meaning to. It just came out of me. It surprised me, how complete it was, how it was exactly what I felt, and exactly what I wanted most in the world at that moment, translated into words. "Don't come any closer to me," how it was a command, not a request. Don't. I had never heard myself sound so sure of anything before in my life, honestly. My voice was the first real sound I'd heard in several minutes, and I was surprised at how loud it felt, breaking the tension and finally starting this, whatever this was. He looked like it startled him too. "Don't be scared," he said after a moment, though he did stop walking towards me. "I'm not scared," I said. "I just don't want you near me." We stood there for a moment at an impasse, looking at each other. "Please," he said. "I got mugged. Someone stole my wallet and my phone. I don't have any money and I need to call someone to come get me." "There's a gas station 1 block over on that avenue right there." I pointed to the right of us. "They have a phone," I suggested. "I'm not from here, and I had too much to drink, and I don't want to get lost," he said. I surprised myself with all the red flags I noticed as soon as they went up. His clear and sober-sounding speech, his local-sounding accent, the fact that I was the first to speak, the one to initiate the dialogue, when if he was the one who needed help, you'd think he would have said something first. The weirdness of someone going out alone and getting drunk on their own in a strange city, instead of hanging out with friends or drinking moderately or anything like that. I know it's not impossible. I've travelled alone myself and enjoyed my own company in plenty of bars, but it all just seemed like a bunch of relatively less than common stuff, and all taken together, it made me wary. He continued, "Will you walk to the gas station with me, or can I borrow your phone?" "No," I said. "You should turn right and walk until you come to the next intersection, and you'll be at a very busy road with a gas station on your left-hand side. Please help me," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need help." He started walking again, towards me. Slow, like how you approach a cat. "Seriously, what's wrong with you? I just need help." I thought of my Leatherman and my flick knife, both of which I use regularly for work, both of which were buried somewhere in the bottom of my hellishly messy purse. My fingers twitched with longing, but I didn't want to be distracted, so I didn't start fumbling around for them. "I told you," I said, raising my voice. "Don't come closer to me." I stepped backwards and hated myself for doing it. It felt like a sort of mini-surrender. He took another step forward. "I won't hurt you," he said. I began crossing the empty street again, walking backwards at first just to keep my eyes on him, and I said, "I'll scream." "There is a cop who is stationed on a bike 4 blocks away. He's there every night and he will hear me scream. He will be here in seconds. You really should turn right at this corner. It will take you directly to the gas station." "If you say so," he said, and I felt the distinct and chilling question within myself, of whether, in his ambiguity, he was referring to the location of the gas station or location of the police officer. He didn't start walking. I stood there, on the other side of the street, wary of taking my eyes off him. But he didn't start walking, so I did. I walked until we were directly across the street from each other, and then I walked further. I glanced at him over my shoulder after a few steps, and he was still there, watching me, going nowhere, just watching me. I walked a few more steps and glanced over my shoulder at him again. He was still standing there. I picked up the pace and went a ways further, looked back. He was gone, completely gone. He had to have moved quickly. a lot quicker than he'd been moving before when he was walking towards me, to reach that intersection and turn right towards the gas station in just those few steps. I couldn't stop wondering, where else could he have gone, moving that quickly, without me watching? I didn't think he could have crossed the whole street and managed to hide somewhere, at least not without me hearing. I glanced at the sidewalk across from me. It was lined with trees and bushes. There were massive gardens all along it, all kinds of yards and stuff like that. There were almost no street lights, and so many shadows. He could be anywhere. I thought about turning down a side street and heading towards the main drag where all the bars and restaurants were. I glanced down one as I passed. No street lights at all, just sleepy, silent buildings all empty for the night, and the bright lights of the next avenue seemed impossibly far away. I kept going straight, and I tried to tell myself to calm the heck down. He was just someone out walking alone, just like I was, nothing more. I even managed to work up some guilt over not doing more to help him. I like to think of myself as a good person, and it bothered me that I had been so rude to someone who really might have needed help. But at the same time, I just couldn't quite make myself relax about it. He was just too suspicious. I wanted to run, but I desperately didn't want to run. Maybe it's just a leftover superstition from childhood, but somehow I felt that a chase never truly begins until you start running. So I walked. Quickly. I looked back. I saw shadows. So many shadows. I walked quicker. I looked back again. Nothing but shadows. I willed myself to calm down, but I couldn't make it happen. Finally, I approached the block where the cop on the bicycle was always waiting behind a few trees. With that grove in sight, I broke into a run. The chase was finally on, if it ever would be. I sprinted, and then as my panic grew, I pushed even faster down that last block. The cop heard me running his way before he really saw me. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked as I approached him, still largely shrouded by the shadows of the trees around him, straddling his bike, peering out at me. "Yes," I replied, feeling silly immediately. "I'm fine, sorry. I just got scared." I smiled an apology and began to make fun of myself, the way we so often do when we feel stupid, but the cop was already looking behind me, over my shoulder. "Sir," he called loudly, finally coming out of the shadows so he could be fully seen. "Can I help you with anything?" "No, thanks," I heard a dreadfully familiar voice say. I turned around, and there was the man, maybe 30 feet behind me, just staring, looking. I can only think that he followed me after all, slinking along in the shadows, that he walked when I walked, and eventually he ran when I ran to keep up, even though full-on running meant abandoning his cover. "Do you know him?" the cop asked. "No," I said quietly. "He told me he got mugged and he wanted me to help him, but I was scared, so I didn't. I didn't help him." Even in that moment, I felt a twinge of guilt. I waited for the man to come closer, to tell the cop that he had been mugged, that he needed a phone, to prove that I was the horrible person in this situation, not him. He said nothing. He waved, then turned around and started walking the other way. He didn't look back. I waited with the police officer, and we watched him walk for several minutes, and then I asked the cop to escort me to my home a block away. When we got to my front door, the cop asked me if I was okay, or if I wanted to make a formal statement. I couldn't really think of what I would even say. I was out walking alone, and I saw another person out walking alone, and I yelled at him when he asked me for help, and then he followed me, and all I really know is he was blonde. Come on, I was a bit shocked and stunned, so I said no, and thanked him for helping me get home safely. I went inside and used my flashlight to get to bed, too scared to turn on the lights for fear that they would render me visible from the street. It wasn't until I was already laying down, sweltering in my unair-conditioned bedroom because I couldn't bear to open the windows, that I found myself wondering, if I hadn't run, if he hadn't been forced to run, and thus abandoned the silent but uneven cover of the shadows and trees, would the police officer have seen him at all? Or would he have remained hidden, watching me, following me right up to my very doorstep, lurking in my own bushes as I climbed the stairs to the porch and fought to get the key in the lock? Would I have waved to the cop bravely, speed-walking my way home, willing myself not to run, with that man slithering behind me the whole time, unseen by either of us? And if so, What then? It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area, a nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble, but take it as a warning. This is not something I would recommend any woman to do, so I hope someone learns from my mistake. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini-mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. A man, dressed head to toe in dark-coloured clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come, and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited, and at any rate the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman, alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it, lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for whom, or whatever the hell, he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I'd turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car. If he'd circled back and seen my parked car alone in the lot. If he'd come in after me. I sat paralyzed with fear and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. But he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Eff it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. I did call the police once I got back home. 2 very nice cops came to my apartment and took a report, and that was unfortunately the last I heard of it, which from what I've seen on this sub is fairly typical, bummer though that is. Dangerous forest stalker, let's never meet again, not even in my nightmares. Back in 2009, I got a call from my friend Kev. This was 2 years after we went our separate ways for college. I was 20 at the time. He had begun to tell me of this island that we had to go to. We had grown up together and spent our youth exploring the ins and outs of our small Midwestern town, so I was all for it. He had explained to me that he and some of his friends had found it when they were exploring in the river. He had told me all about it and was excited to share his find with another person. I was jealous that I wasn't there when it was first discovered, but I got over it and got pumped to see what he had unearthed. It's been a running joke that I don't know how to swim, never did, probably never will, and the island lay in the middle of the river. Usually the waters weren't high, so he reassured me that all I had to do was wade behind him, and our other friend Stu would be behind me in case I hit a sinkhole. Sucking up my nervousness of aquatic things, I agreed, and we popped off our shirts and sunk into the muddy waters. The island looked close from the banks, but took some time to get to in the chest-high waters. As we floated with the current, we made jokes and spent our time goofing around. None of us had a camera due to the fact that we didn't want to get our phones wet, and who really cared? He had already taken pictures from his last quest. Now was just time to show us. Once we pulled our bodies up onto the land, we took a minute to breathe. Kev had taken his shoes off to keep them dry and left them with our t-shirts, but it wasn't a place to be without feet protection. Wild bushes and branches lay strewn about everywhere. The island looked fairly untouched. It was in the river next to a state park, but still deep enough down where people wouldn't bother it. We followed Kev's lead into this thistle, and after 4 or 5 minutes, we found a clearing towards the centre. In it lay what we were looking for. There was a giant cement sculpture of a lady's bare rear end, sitting next to a lawn chair. This wasn't just some art project, it was well detailed. There was a marble stuffed in her, to resemble a clitoris, and was massive. We laughed and romped around, but I had a strange feeling on the island. It felt weird. My other 2 friends seemed a little creeped out, but generally blew it off. It stuck with me. A few weeks later, I decided that I have to go back to VJ Island, appropriately coined by Kev, but my friends had no real interest in going again. About that time I was living in my first apartment with a roommate during college, and had a few friends back home. My college was only an hour and a half away, so the travel was no big deal, and was always worth it when I pulled into my old driveway. I had been talking to a girl online, and decided that she, my friend Ethan, my roommate Joe and I would meet for the first time, and that I would take her to VJ Island. It had a mystical pull to it, and those that I told didn't seem to believe me, so we agreed. Joe and I picked up Ethan and eventually met up with Anna, who uneasily got into my car, but we all hit it off quick. The drive was about 40 minutes, so we stopped to buy basketball shorts that we could wear into the river. Ethan had my wetsuit from my trunk that I had carried around for a couple years because I was young and it was humorous, and we picked up a waterproof disposable camera. We get ready to go and make it to the island. I'm unfamiliar with the layout since Kev led the way, so we wandered around until we were able to find where we needed to be. The first thing that caught my eye was that it was different from last time, just a few days before. The bottom of the lady is still there, but this time there is more, and it has grown in creepiness in an intense manner. Next to the bottom half is a full-bodied woman, laying in a pale white cement, staring up at the sky. This immediately freaked us all out, especially after I had hyped up the VJ sculpture. She looked ghostly. She was wearing nothing but rain boots, and her nipples had been painted gold. We each shot glances towards each other, and then to her. Our first reaction was that it was a real person, so we inched slowly towards it and swiveled the rain boot. She cracked and showed wire reinforcements under it. I let out a huge sigh of relief under my breath, and we continued to look around. I still had a weird feeling and joked about setting up a camera to catch this guy to see who he was. When looking through the trees to find a place for our imaginary camera is when I saw more. Another VJ hung from a tree just over our shoulders. At this point we all start getting a bit freaked out and notice that there are candles by the chair. At the time I couldn't remember if I was so caught up in the excitement the first time or if these were new too. All it took was for one of us to say let's go, and we all followed suit behind. It wasn't quite the fun, carefree romp that I had promised. It wasn't long until the next afternoon I was sitting with Ethan, and we had decided that we needed to go back to VJ Island. Perfect. Someone as intrigued by it as I was. We called up a different girl, Sherry. Sherry was a small girl, and wasn't too thrilled about going, since we decided to go at 5 in the morning and see if we could catch the guy in the act. Upon packing up, we grabbed a couple of baseball bats and set out into the dark woods to make it to the river. Once reaching the water, we realized how badly we had underestimated the temperature of the river when the sun wasn't warming it up. We felt the chills go through our legs and up into our chests. Sherry wasn't having it. We took turns carrying her on our shoulders to keep her dry, which did nothing to make wading any easier, but at least she was a small girl. We made it and pulled out a flashlight and began to go through the thick of it. I felt an ominous fear grip me but said nothing. I couldn't be the friend that was too scared. I had grown up being that friend, so this time there was no backing down. Everything that was creepy in the daylight was even worse spotted by the moon. But we had made it. We stopped for a photo op before looking around. The first thing that caught my attention was the dead stare of the statue in the dirt. Leaves had fallen on her, and we kicked some of them away. She looked different, though. My heart started pounding as I realized that her groin had been painted gold since we were there yesterday. We crept closer and kicked away some leaves. Once moving some, we noticed something that had been covered. There was a cement plaque next to her that read, "Equestrian." I inched away from the statue and tried to regain my cool composure. Had I smoked the way I do now, a pack may have already been gone. We all quickly looked around us to make sure that we were alone. There weren't any other sounds, but the two of us gripped our bats tight, hoping that we wouldn't have to save the lone girl trapped on an island at 5 in the morning. We caught the female body part hanging from the tree again, and shivers climbed up each spine individually. This time we noticed that it wasn't the only thing strung up from a branch. Right over my left shoulder was a collection of feathers, what appeared to be some kind of charm, and a shotgun shell. At this point, we had all decided that there was no need to be the bigger man, and said it was time to go. First the statue, then the chair and candle, then the things in the tree. We had seen enough. This was all capped off by the fact that in just the short 20 hours we had been gone, somebody had been there working. I think Ethan and I had made up our minds that we were no longer alone on this island. We started looking for something to take with us, for a trinket that would go unnoticed, and scrounged around for a few minutes before I noticed a piece of bark next to the chair. On it was a very detailed picture of a woman's lower region, and written in black ink it said, "Looking for 40-plus-year-old models." We were all pretty satisfied and filled with fear by this, and took off back across the river. We stomped through, carrying Sherry on our shoulders and making a lot of noise. With each splash came the thought that someone was behind me. The cold of the water and struggle of the extra weight made my knees buckle, and Sherry and I toppled into the river, We had never been so happy to be back on the other side. A few months went by and Ethan sent me a text message. He had been walking through a park by his college, about an hour driving distance to the bank of the river. Holy chips, was all that the text message said. It had a picture attached. It was the same guy's handwriting, paired with the same statement looking for models. Where Ethan was at the time was deep in the woods of a park known for hiking by college students. It was a college park. I remember my mind jumping when I saw that picture. I had thrown away the tree bark about a week prior, due to just that. It was tree bark. None of us had gone back for some time. We spent a lot of time sharing our story with people, but never telling them where it was pinpointed. An island in the river by the state park gave a wide variety of options. It was our little secret. By now it is 2012, and Ethan and I no longer talk. I had talked up VJ Island with my friend Kai from Colorado, and when she came to visit for a week, I knew what we would be doing during one of the days. Pumped due to the fact that I hadn't been back in years and so much more could be there, I sped to the park and we broke off the trail towards the river. The summer was very dry last year and the tips of our shoes didn't even get wet. The entire river had dried up for the season. It was the first time I had ever seen the Platte River this low. As we walk towards the island, I am talking it up. The sun is up, so I'm a bit braver, and we get into the thick of the woods. It didn't take long to notice that it was all removed. The giant body part statue, the tree decorations, the chair, the candles, all of it. All that was left dangled from a tree. I walked up to it and saw that it was a bone of some sort. I assumed it was an animal's and got closer to see that a dollar bill had been rolled up tightly and stuffed through it. I pulled the dollar out and we left disappointed. Until this day, I have never found out any more about it. Ethan and I had spent a lot of nights discussing calling the police or the park rangers and having them check it out, but we enjoyed our little secret. I regret not calling, and curiosity continues to eat at me. After all, there weren't really any signs of a crime. Just some eccentric artist getting his freaky fantasy work on. It just felt creepy and mysterious. The Platte River is not thin, and these statues were not small. We often bounced ideas back and forth of how he would get the cement there, or if he did his work on the island by simply hauling a bag of cement across and adding the water upon arrival. All of it will forever remain a mystery, and that may be the most difficult part about it, but also the most beautiful. This particular event happened almost a year ago, sometime in mid-October. A couple of friends and I drove out to visit an old friend of ours from high school, George, who now lived about an hour out of the city. We spent the whole day with him, and it was really late when we finally decided to start the drive back home. My friend Lisa was passed out in the passenger seat. She'd had a few drinks and decided to spend the ride home asleep. My other friend Sam was sitting in the back seat behind Lisa and was playing a game on her smartphone. I, of course, was driving, and I was following the GPS instructions back to the freeway. At that moment, we were driving down a dark street with thick trees bordering both sides. Everything was pretty peaceful, with the only sounds I could hear being that of the car moving along the road, and the radio on low volume. Suddenly, my car let out a loud jolt, and it felt as if I had hit something. Sam let out a shocked scream while Lisa remained dead asleep. I slammed on the brakes and the car came to a halt. I was breathing heavily when I asked what the hell had just happened. Sam peered through the back window and gasped. She turned to me with an angry look on her face and shouted that I had just hit a dog. I looked through their back window, and sure enough, a dog was lying in the road a few yards behind the car. Sam is a pretty big animal lover, so I wasn't surprised to see her get pissed at me. She was about to open her door and rush to the animal's aid when I stopped her. Once I had gotten over the shock of running over a dog, I got a feeling in my gut that told me that something was off. I'm no braggart, but I consider myself to be a very attentive and safe driver. My eyes were on the road at all times, and I distinctly remember not seeing any dog in the road prior to the car jolting. Yes, it was dark, but I was sure that I would have at least seen the dog in the headlights before hitting it. I looked through the back window and took a closer look at the dog, or at least as much as I could make out in the reddish light coming from my tail lights. It was a fairly big dog, at least a golden retriever or something like that. One particular detail caught my attention. I could see the dog's tail wagging. Now, I'm no expert on the mannerisms of animals, but I was sure the last thing a dog would do after being hit by a car would be to wag its tail. After a moment of thought, I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and sped off. Sam snapped at me and ordered me to go back, but I told her that something was wrong with the whole situation. She continued to argue, but she fell silent as she turned back towards the back window. She asked, "What the heck?" with a shaken voice. I looked in the rear-view mirror. Though it was dark, I was able to make out the silhouettes of 3 large figures emerging from the trees on the side of the road. The dog was now up on its feet and jumping around joyfully. The 3 figures looked in our direction as I pressed my foot down on the gas harder and sped off. Sam and I remained silent for the rest of the ride home. It wasn't until a few days later that we told Lisa about it. We've been back to visit George a few times since then, but we always make sure to leave before sunset. It concerns me that these people might have pulled this operation on others, previously and thereafter. Still, I dread to think about what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car. So this story happened to me when I was 15 years old. I was a super lonely girl. My home life was in shambles. Mum was cheating on Dad and told me about it. And I had just started at a new high school the year prior, where I didn't know anyone. Creating art quickly became my biggest coping mechanism, and to this day I still love to draw. I discovered the website DeviantArt around this time, and started submitting my drawings every day. Through this, I made some friends online of all ages. Some very talented people were giving me positive feedback on my work, and this really inspired me. In my deep depression, I felt like DA was a safe haven of like-minded people who appreciated one another. For the first time in a long time, I belonged somewhere. I spent many hours talking to some regulars on the site. Even now, 10 years later, a few of them are still in my life, and I cherish their friendship. But this story is about someone who I never want to meet ever again. DeviantArt also allows writers to submit their stories and poetry to the site. One day I was on the front page and a poem caught my eye. It was more of an angry rant, full of weird twisted imagery and anti-Christian subtext. Sounds stupid, I know, but it was actually quite well written and funny, at least to my 15-year-old self. Being a very angry, depressed high schooler, I was drawn in and decided to check this artist out. Not only was he a prolific writer with maybe 100 poems and stories on his site, but this man was a very talented visual artist as well. He created amazing illustrations of weird, funny creatures. Some of them were a little sexual, like naked women, but most of them were humorous or gross. His name was Tom. The combination of Tom's writing and visual art skills intrigued me. Even though he was 30 years old, I decided to send him a private message. We bonded. Soon we began to talk on AIM. I would look forward to talking to Tom every day, and came straight home after school to connect with him. Chatting for 5 hours was a daily thing for us. In hindsight, my family probably wondered what I was doing, but they never said anything. Side note, parents, if you notice your teen kids acting or doing things that seem out of the ordinary, especially on the internet, do them a favor and open a dialogue. Pay attention to who is paying attention to your kids. Anyway, isolating myself in my room wasn't abnormal at this point. I was so grateful for my artistic friend. I could be as dark and confident as I wanted when we talked. I unloaded a lot of my pain onto him, and he told me about his troubles too. Tom even started to write poetry about me, happy poetry. It made me feel very special because I had softened this angry dude's heart with my friendship, or so I thought. He was reliable, always online whenever I came home. After maybe 3 weeks of talking, Tom asked for my phone number because he wanted to hear my voice. I was extremely uncomfortable with this, and reluctant. He insisted and gave me his number to call. Fearing I would lose a friend who was so important to me, I finally gave in. I should mention that I'm an adult now, and I'm still a shy person. But at 15, I was painfully awkward and detested phone calls. My heart was racing, and I was shaky and sweaty as the phone rang. Tom picked up. "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. Tom spoke. I knew his age, but to my relief he sounded like a teenage boy. This made me feel less uncomfortable, but still weirded out. I had no idea what to talk about, and for some reason I felt like crying. Tom and I spoke for a bit. He laughed at the awkward things I said, so I guess the conversation went alright. Honestly, I can't remember what we talked about. All I remember is that he barely spoke at all. We got off the phone and talked online more. He said how happy he was to hear my voice. I was still pretty upset, but glad that I didn't disappoint him. I hoped he wouldn't ask me to call him again because it was such a stressful experience. But I'd poured so much time into talking to this man that I was willing to be uncomfortable to preserve our friendship. My self-esteem was non-existent. The next day, Tom wanted me to call again. On the phone, I could hear him breathing heavily. He was masturbating. I talked about my day at school, some random thoughts. He stayed silent apart from the breathing. Then, when I was mid-sentence, he hung up on me. When I asked him what happened over AIM, he told me I wasn't talking about anything sexy, something along those lines. I apologized and felt a total sense of failure. The conversation then turned sexual. I told him that I was a virgin. In reality, I hadn't even had a real first kiss. Tom was overjoyed by this. Now, I really had his attention. At this point, it was May. Our relationship progressed to the point that I let him jerk off to my voice and even sent him some pictures of me in my underwear when he asked. I had no idea what I was doing, but felt like I had to obey him, or he wouldn't be my friend. He started to write poetry about taking a girl's virginity. To his fans on DeviantArt, they were just fictional poems about a fictional girl. But I knew they were really for me. This both thrilled me and made me queasy. My 16th birthday was coming up in June. Tom and I constantly talked about how badly we wanted to see each other. In the back of my mind, I really missed the days before everything got so sexual. I told him there was no way I could ever fly to Florida, where he lived. Tom insisted on seeing me before my 16th birthday. Eventually we picked a date. He found a hotel near my family's house that was relatively affordable, and even bought tickets to fly out. The plan was that I would skip school that day and spend the day with him so he could take my virginity. I can't remember if he was even going to stay more than one day, to be honest. Before we said our goodnights, Tom wrote, "Will you let me get your ass too?" Not a question, a statement. I came home from school one day and my mum was extremely solemn. She told me she knows about Tom. Apparently I had remained signed in on AOL, but I think she actually got my password to see what I was up to. I began to cry and defended Tom at first, but then I admitted I was terrified of him. I was so ashamed that my mom saw our sexual conversations, but she hugged me and told me, "He won't be coming, I promise." She emailed Tom, which really rightfully spooked him. Tom began to yell at me and blew up my phone. He told me he spent $500 on plane tickets that he couldn't get back. I never picked up any of his calls. He wrote me tons of emails in all caps. He wrote angry, violent poetry on DA about how I betrayed him. I was devastated and hated myself. On the day Tom was supposed to come visit, I stayed at my best friend's house, which was miles away, in a totally different community. My mother gave our apartment building a photo of Tom to make sure nobody let him in. I was totally paranoid that he would pop up for a while after that, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all. He stopped submitting any art or poetry. Over a month went by and Tom was still MIA. My family and I went to Canada for a music festival. Life was slowly going back to normal and my guilt was fading. Suddenly in our hotel room my phone rang. It was Tom. I tried to pick up and I can't remember why, but for some reason since we were in Canada I couldn't talk to him. I think it's because I had an American service provider or something. In any event, he left me messages. My memory of this is very foggy. He may have actually been texting me. I can't remember at all. A few days later, we took a train back to the US, and as soon as we crossed the border, I sent him a text. I apologized for what happened and explained that I was in Canada, but that I missed him and I hoped he could forgive me. Tom told me the reason he was gone for so long. He said that on the day he was supposed to come see me, he got very drunk and tried to kill himself. He stabbed himself all over, including his stomach, left hand and legs. Feeling last-minute regret, he called his mother and she called the police. He told me that his whole apartment was considered a biohazard from all the blood, and after he recovered he spent time in the psych ward. Tom had mutilated himself so badly that the hospital had to amputate his leg and he lost 2 fingers. He told me this was my fault. I was utterly speechless and my blood ran ice cold. I refused to believe him, but lo and behold, he uploaded some pictures of himself on DeviantArt. His leg was amputated above the knee and he was missing fingers. I had seen previous photos of him and this was my friend, all right. It's hard to explain how I feel about this situation. I feel very sad for Tom, but I also understand that this wasn't my fault. I was a very lonely child and desperate for a friend. Tom was a schizophrenic man and a pedo, as was later revealed by his explicit poetry about little girls. Eventually he was banned from DeviantArt, and I never talked to him again after age 16. A few years ago I looked him up and found his profile on a different site. Admittedly, I was Googling him to see if he was still alive. In his profile picture he was next to a young woman with his hand over her mouth. It looked like he found someone who was willing to visit him after all. So Tom, I hope you're okay, but please let's not ever meet. P.S. If I take this story down, it's because I'm afraid. The following account occurred years ago during the summer of 2012. It has always been difficult for me to talk about, but I have found writing about it to be therapeutic. I was 17 at the time, and I had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s, early 50s, probably 6'5", and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered and he had a long beard. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in the area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff? Toiletries and things like that?" "Yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items and he paid with crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked, "You cook too? What is this, an interview?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said, as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, Mom's friend / my boss, about the bizarre encounter and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods, which he claimed he built with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he bought at the store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time, he even said I had the birthing hips that men lust after. Shudder. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, and so on, and I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night I was closing up, and it was late, around 10 at night. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. but I didn't see him in the lot, just his car. So I walked quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't piss myself. I didn't even want to look because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad is on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed. "No, he's not," he said. "Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "Leave me alone." Suddenly he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops," I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here, that could be a while. "The cops are on their way, leave now," I screamed at him, who didn't seem to let it deter him, but after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful he would leave me alone, but then he started walking back toward me with a damn crowbar in hand. "No!" I screamed at him. "Get the F away from me!" He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly I heard male voices shouting, telling him to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at him. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on the way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away, and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his meds, and his issues were only getting worse. My cousin Luke is a cop, and later on he told me some more about the case that he had heard about through some other officers. The police did a search of the cabin after the incident, to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. They found a journal that he kept. Apparently in it he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot, thanks to my stupid name tag, and Luke said there were a lot of lewd things in there about me that he didn't want to share, but tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, he has been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good. I'm so appreciative that those men stepped up and defended me. But Crazy Mountain Man, let's seriously not meet again. Alright, this is an essay, but a lot happens. Bear with me. My next door neighbour's parents moved from India to the UK back in the 60s. After retiring, they made a habit of heading back there every year to visit family and friends, ultimately spending around half their time travelling through India and half the time here. Long story short, one year they invited my family along. I was 15, now 25 as I write this, and thought I was some badass Viking rock prince because I had long blonde hair. Fun fact, curly hair ruins everything. I looked like a damn cherub. Now, my neighbour's dad has planned this holiday like it's a military campaign. When we arrive, he hands each of us, including my 11-year-old brother and sister, a brown folder containing our itinerary. hotel brochures, money conversion charts, train timetables, 4 passport photos of ourselves for forms, etc., and a list of names under the header Useful People. Forget Viking rock prints, I'm James Bond. Other than the fact that I'm mistaken for a girl on several occasions, my favourite being when one of my neighbour's relatives asks my mum why she lets me dress like a boy and offers to have a sari fitted for me. I have an amazing time until we rock up to this huge hotel in the middle of the jungle. Honestly, the arse end of nowhere. The nearest village is a 3-hour drive down a dirt road, just before sunset, in the damn jungle. I pull out the brochure. It would be safe to say that this place is under new management. There's a single light on, about 5 stories up. As we pull into the drive, we spot a group of men clustered around a large fire. One of them stands and starts shouting something, but is silenced by the guy next to him with a slap to the back of his head. One of the group comes sauntering over and motions our driver to roll down the window. Imagine Alfred Hitchcock as an Indian drug lord, and you'll have a pretty good idea of the man now flapping his jowls through our window. He peers into the back, spots us and cracks the dictionary definition of a shite-eating grin. In broken English he welcomes us to the hotel, glances over our reservations and ushers us into the lobby. This is when things get really strange. The place is deserted. Not the staff have gone to bed deserted. It was like whoever was here noped it out of this place in a hurry, deserted. There were toppled chairs in the lobby. Hitchcock tells us that our rooms aren't ready. It is now 9 p.m. and offers us some food while we wait. The dining room is huge, empty, and our order is taken by a boy no older than 9 who promptly vanishes, closing the doors behind him. We hear a motorbike engine outside, and an hour later something vaguely resembling our order appears on a variety of mismatched dinnerware. No idea where any of it came from. At this point we were all pretty unnerved, and everyone started making lame jokes to ease the tension. We were only there for one night, everything had been paid for in advance, and we were a large group, 11 in total, with 2 people who spoke Hindi and Konkani, so we felt pretty sure we could deal with any weirdness. Hitchcock waddles in and takes us to our rooms. Every one of them is stripped bare apart from the beds and bedside tables. Exposed wires poke out of the walls where you'd expect a TV or phone, and there are rectangular patches of discoloured wallpaper, suggesting that someone finally took a stand against terrible hotel artwork. The only decoration is this spooky little metal horse that's just sitting on one of the bedside tables. Since I'm sharing with my little bro, I insist on taking the bed closest to the door, presumably thinking that I could summon Thor if things got hairy. Hitchcock lingers in our doorway for a while, flashing his pearly browns and giving me the rape eyes, clearly mistaking me for a girl. I close the door on him. We dump our bags, check the door is locked, and have bro chats until we pass out. I wake up, no clue when. Clocks clearly didn't fit with the whole minimalist crack den vibe the management were going for, but it's pitch black. I hear the door to my room clicking shut, the door that is no further than a foot from my head. Screw that. I'm no Viking rock prince, I'm a flying baby that plays a harp. I cower under the surprisingly clean blankets until my heart stops threatening to bust out of my ribs and redecorate the ceiling. Stealthy ninja roll out of my bed and to the door. The bastard is unlocked. Screw this. Barricade that thing with the bedside table. Check little bro is alive. Get into bed, see our bags, add them to the barricade. Notice that mine is open. Screw everything. Plot twist. Nothing's missing. Camera, wallet, clothes, super secret spy dossier. Everything is intact. I convince myself that I shat my pants over nothing and go back to sleep. Side note, little bro slept through the whole thing. Morning comes and we all want to get out of there as soon as possible. Neighbour's dad kicks off to Hitchcock about how weird the whole thing is and gets half of our money back. Excellent. We head outside and my sister points out the charred remains of one of the hotel beds in what's left of the fire pit. Real nice. Turns out that our driver, who had a room in the place, had decided to sleep in the bus because he, in his own words, didn't want their funny business. Apparently there were people coming and going all night. He woke up to see a guy, nose against the window, just staring in at him. Driver hit the window and the dude scampered off into the jungle like freaking Mowgli. We give the driver an extra huge tip. Hitchcock waves at us from the lobby, adjusts his crotch and plods back in. We leave, thinking the weirdness is over. Shy Milan. About an hour into the journey, I decide to take a look at our itinerary, so I pull out my spy folder. My heart instantly sinks. One of my passport photos is gone. A perfect 35 by 45mm rectangle missing from the corner. 3 little Viking rock cherubs stare up at me, mourning their fallen brother. I search the folder, ask my parents if they took it for something, start losing my shite. Everything from the night before rushes back. I explain what happened, and there's this weird moment of silence while everyone looks at each other. Turns out that everybody hears someone outside at their door at some point during the night, but had deadbolted them before going to sleep. Bro and I had no deadbolt. Hitchcock put us in that dumb room on purpose. Driver suggests that we head back to the hotel and demand satisfaction. Tips galore for driver. We arrived at the hotel. The doors are padlocked. Hitchcock and his cronies have vanished. The cherry on top of this mind-screw cake is the horse. The little metal horse that was sat on our bedside table has been placed on the step in front of the doors. I took it. Free souvenir. Screw you, Hitchcock. In all honesty, I bloody love India, and have been back there twice since this. It is an amazing country, and the people are, on the whole, incredibly warm and welcoming. You just get the odd emphasis on that word. Few who really skew the average do go to India. Don't go to scary jungle hotels. I grew up in a town with just under 900 people. When I was 14, my entire class was 42 students. It's a farming community in Oregon, basically in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by other small farming towns. My best friend Sarah and I went to the varsity baseball games. We had nothing better to do. It was fun, and Sarah's older brother Aaron was a pitcher. Aaron's best friend Sam was 1 year out of high school, an assistant coach to the baseball team. Sarah and Aaron's parents often left us at their house alone with alcohol and no rules. My parents didn't care what I was doing, and even though Sam still lived with his parents at 19, Sarah and I had never met them. I suppose they didn't care either. The 4 of us hung out at the house at the same time. Because we were only 14, Aaron and Sam kept a brotherly eye on us. None of their senior friends would touch us, even if we threw ourselves at them in a drunken haze. Basically, it was Aaron and Sam's fault we didn't have boyfriends freshman year. It was one of the last games of the season. Aaron was pitching and Sam was coaching. After losing the game, the team plus Sarah and I went to throw a party as usual. The parties always happened. Win, lose, or rain. We drank and hung out, listened to music and played drinking games. We were all completely average teenagers with average small-town lives. After I had consumed far more vodka than orange juice, I spilled a drink on the kitchen floor. Sam helped me clean it up and we stood around talking a little bit before he insisted I go lay down before I fell on my face. He helped me to Sarah's room, gave me a little hug and put me on the bed. Before he drove home, he checked on me, gave me a little wave and said goodnight. I passed out in fuzzy bliss. No matter how many times I go over the next day in my head, it never seems right. It was surreal, something I have never understood. The next thing I remember was hearing screaming. Sarah and I woke up to her mother freaking out. In the living room, both Sarah's parents, Aaron, and the Douglas County Sheriff stood. Everyone seemed really upset. I felt sick and terrified. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. The sheriff asked me when the last time I saw Sam was. I couldn't speak, couldn't figure out what any of them were saying anymore. I was hella disoriented. I managed to say I was drunk. The sheriff asked Sarah and she said the same. He simply wrote it down and turned away from us. Very strange. They had to find Sam. Sam was missing. Sam was running away. Finally, I started putting thoughts together. Sam was running from the police because he had killed his parents. He killed them when he got home from the party with an axe from the woodshed. He had attended the game and the party, then went home, picked up an axe and struck his father in the head while he was watching TV. His mother made it to the phone and dialed 911. Sam killed her with blows from the axe while she spoke to the 911 operator. Then he disappeared for 2 days. Honestly, from the moment I learned what had happened until Sam turned himself in, I was in a daze. I kept expecting it to be a dream or a sick joke. The whole 2 days I can't remember what I did, who I talked to. It didn't help that Sarah and I increased our alcohol and drug intake. He was such a normal, nice guy. None of us saw what he was capable of. We were all just typical kids. This was 20 years ago. People still avoid talking about it. I never tell the story either until now. Also, I made a lot of poor, naive decisions along the way. If you're one of the being uncomfortable doesn't make a good story types, you will find this underwhelming. When I was in college, I would frequently party with my boyfriend Cody and his roommates. One of the roommates, Drew, was from a small town nearby and had friends up from there often. I became close with most of these people and assumed they would all be pretty cool, as they were tight with Drew. One weekend, Drew's friend Tim comes up to party. We all start out in the dorms pre-gaming together, but by the time we're ready to head to the party off campus, some people are throwing up. It's just going to be Tim and I headed across the city to meet up with some more people from Drew's town. I've liked all the people I've met so far, and I'm down to party. Tim and I have drank together with the group a few times, and it's always a good but crazy time. Tim decides he's had enough uppers that he can still drive, so we get in the car and head over. On the way, Tim gets lost and has to call for directions. This is a small residential area full of intersections, and we are turning at every one. It becomes really hard to keep track of where we are. It's dark and I'm pretty tipsy, but I am trying because our crew might meet us if they can get their mess together. We finally arrive at the party, and I decide to just leave my shoes in Tim's car because we have to take them off inside, but I don't want them to get stolen. As soon as we get in, it starts to get weird. There's almost no one there, and the house is obviously being repaired. Also, someone's sister was supposedly hosting, but there are no girls about except me. There are 2 other guys playing a drinking game with cards, and we join them. Then Tim starts saying bizarre things. At first I thought he was being awkwardly helpful by explaining we knew each other through my boyfriend, as in, I have one, so don't hit on me. But it quickly turns into a weird pissing contest with Cody, who isn't even around. Tim is telling any embarrassing tidbit about Cody that he can, from stories of out drinking him to how often he talks with his mother. It's super awkward for me, and I try to steer the conversation away, but Tim keeps fitting jabs in. It's extra strange because we have only hung out with Tim 3 or 4 times before this. Finally, the group decides to smoke some pot, and the party moves into the kitchen where we can smoke. I'm feeling uncomfortable and have slowly stopped drinking to sober up. They offer me a hit, but I have no intention of taking it. I should mention the way we were smoking was all individual hits, so the piece would have to be repacked for each person. This first one was packed before we came into the kitchen. Anyway, I say I don't want to smoke, and they all start peer pressuring me. Since I normally smoke, I start to relent, but I stipulate that I want a smaller hit, and someone should take the big one that was waiting. They really want me to take it for some reason, and when I start to get annoyed about it, they abruptly change the subject away from smoking at all and start arguing about some unrelated common interest they all have, and move the party back to the living room. I'm starting to feel really disturbed about the whole situation. I tell Tim I want to head back soon, and he insists he's way too drunk to drive by now. I'm pretty insistent that I'm going to walk back. I ask him for the address so I can Google map how to get home, but he only gives me the street name. He also doesn't want to give me his keys so I can get my shoes, but he's not ready to go to the car to get them. I finally decided to just walk home barefoot and leave. My phone dies soon after mapping my way home and texting my boyfriend I'm on my way. I'm pretty lost, but I start traveling the general direction I need to go. This isn't a good neighborhood, and I'm walking pretty quickly. A few blocks later, and I notice there's a couple of guys also going my way, trailing a few blocks back. I assume they're also just heading to campus, but I changed my route anyway, so we would be traveling on parallel streets. Basically, I cut over a block, but a few blocks later, they're behind me again. Still a ways off, but it just doesn't make sense why they would travel that way. I decide I really don't like it, and start doing zigzag blocks so they aren't traveling behind me, but they keep ending up a block or so behind me. I finally made it somewhere I can catch a campus bus. There's a crowd waiting, and somehow once I reach it, the guys tailing me disappear. When I get back to the dorms, everyone is freaking out. Apparently my zigzagging made the walk take a lot longer than it should have. When Cody couldn't reach me because my phone was dead, he called Tim assuming we would be traveling together. Tim told Cody that he dropped me off back at campus soon after I had left the party. So everyone became concerned I wasn't home and started looking for me. They were actually about to call campus security. When we asked him about it the next day, Tim just shrugged it off and said he was drunk and didn't remember talking to Cody. I think it was something more sinister. Why else would he tell them he dropped me off? Was it him that was tailing me? What were they trying to get me to smoke? The guys still hang out with Tim, but I don't. Also, Cody and I have since split up, so I have thoroughly moved on from that bunch. Please be smarter than I was. Stay safe out there.